On the afternoon of August 18, 1979, in front of 2,147 people packed into the wooden grandstands at the Buchanan County Fair in Independence, Iowa, a man named Donald Thompson made the single most expensive decision of his life. The sun hung low at 5:15, casting long shadows across the dirt track where tractors had been pulling weighted sleds since 2 o'clock. The air carried that peculiar blend of diesel exhaust fried corn dogs and livestock that defined every county fair across the Midwest. Donald stood beside his cherry-red Ford F-25O checkbook in hand, waving it high enough for half the crowd to see. $10,000. That's what he announced, his voice carrying across the staging area where 15 tractors sat waiting for the championship round. $10,000, said his brand-new John Deere 444 would beat Kenneth Anderson's rusted Farmall 560 in the finals. The crowd noise dropped to a murmur, then silence. Someone in the grandstand laughed nervously. Donald's Rolex caught the sunlight as he gestured broadly, that gold watch worth more than most farmers earned in 3 months. Have you ever watched someone bet everything on their pride? Not just money, though. 10,000 in 1979 bought what 50,000 buys today. But reputation, standing the carefully constructed image of a man who needed everyone to know he mattered. Donald Thompson had spent 23 years building himself into the biggest farmer in Buchanan County. 3 minutes from now, he would start tearing it all down. What nobody in that grandstand knew, what Donald himself didn't understand, was that he wasn't betting against a tractor. He was betting against a ghost. His father had died 14 years earlier, killed when a tractor rolled on steep ground during spring planting. George Thompson's last conversation with his son played on endless loop in Donald's memory. The old man had criticized Donald for buying a new combine, when the old one ran fine, for joining every board and committee in the county, for caring more about impressing neighbors than working smart. George's final words, spoken 3 hours before the accident, carried the weight of prophecy. Now, son, you're trying too hard to impress people who don't matter. Donald had interpreted that as failure, as not being tough enough, not being successful enough, not being enough. So he'd spent 14 years proving the ghost wrong, buying the biggest equipment, accumulating the most land, sitting on the county board, the co-op board, the church finance committee, first farmer in Buchanan County to own a John Deere 4440. His office walls displayed 23 framed certificates and awards, each one a small victory against the memory of his father's disappointment. Now he stood in the staging area, 48 years old, brown hair graying at the temples, 6'1", and stocky from too many diner breakfasts and not enough physical work anymore. He wore Lucchese boots that cost $425, custom ordered from Texas. His belt buckle came from the Iowa Cattlemen's Association, heavy silver that caught light like a mirror. The wedding ring on his left hand carried a family crest he'd designed himself, paying a jeweler in Des Moines $200 to engrave it properly. Donald owned 2,200 acres of prime northeast Iowa farmland. His grandfather had bought the original 800 acres during the Depression for $12 an acre, land that farmers were abandoning when grain prices collapsed and banks foreclosed on half the county. The Thompsons had survived when others failed, and Donald wore that survival like armor. Every new piece of equipment, every land purchase, every board position reinforced The same message. The Thompsons matter. I matter. You can't ignore us. Except Kenneth Anderson had been ignoring him for years, and that grated on Donald worse than sandpaper on sunburn. Kenneth Anderson stood beside his Farmall, 500, 44 years old, dark brown hair, quiet in the way that people mistake for simple. He owned 280 acres. His grandfather had arrived from Nebraska in 1919 as a failed homesteader, working 15 years as a hired hand before saving enough to buy 160 acres. Kenneth's father, Robert Anderson, had expanded that to 280 acres through careful management and zero debt. When Robert died in 1965, the same year George Thompson rolled his tractor, he left everything to his only son. Kenneth had farmed those acres for 14 years with the same philosophy his father taught: own what you have before reaching for more. The Farmall 560, parked in the staging area, had faded red paint, the color closer to dried blood after 18 years of sun and weather. A dent marked the hood where a hay bale had fallen in 1972. The left rear fender hung from baling wire, a temporary fix that had lasted 7 years because it worked fine, and Kenneth saw no reason to spend money on cosmetics. The exhaust stack showed more carbon buildup than metal. To anyone looking, this tractor belonged in a scrapyard, not a competition. Donald had looked at that tractor and seen everything he despised about farmers who refused to invest in their operations. Kenneth Anderson represented stagnation, the kind of thinking that kept agriculture stuck in the past, while progress demanded better equipment, bigger-scale modern techniques. The Farmall 560 symbolized everything Donald had spent his adult life rejecting. What Donald didn't know, what nobody except Kenneth and his friend Gary Young knew, was that the Farmall 560, sitting in the staging area, wasn't a standard production model. Winter of 1971. Kenneth had pulled the engine to replace a cracked head gasket, routine maintenance that most farmers paid mechanics to handle. Kenneth did his own work partly from necessity and partly from the satisfaction of understanding every component in his equipment. Gary Young had stopped by that January afternoon, finding Kenneth in the barn with the Farmall's engine block exposed. Gary was 46, then ran a machine shop in Cedar Rapids, had served with Kenneth during their military stint in the early 50s when both were young men learning diesel engines on Army equipment. Gary had looked at those cylinders and known immediately something wasn't standard. The bore was wrong. The pistons carried modifications no factory line would install in a production tractor. The camshaft profile didn't match any International Harvester specification manual. "Kenneth, this isn't a regular 560. Gary's voice had carried certainty born from 30 years working with engines. Kenneth had noticed the differences, but assumed the previous owner had modified it. Gary's examination revealed something else entirely: professional engineering, factory-grade machining, components that International Harvester built for a testing, not for sale. Gary made phone calls to dealer contacts, old military buddies who'd gone into agricultural equipment, finally reaching a retired IH engineer in Chicago. The story emerged piece by piece. In 1962, International Harvester was developing what would become the Farmall 706, a bigger, more powerful tractor to replace the 560 series. They'd modified a batch of 560s with prototype components, testing designs before committing to production. Most of those test mules got scrapped after the development program ended. Somehow, one had slipped through sold as a used standard 560 to a dealer in Cedar Rapids who either didn't know or didn't care what sat in his lot. Kenneth's father had bought it in 1967 for $2,800, thinking he'd found a well-maintained used tractor. He'd never known what ran under that hood. Kenneth discovered the truth 4 years after his father's death. The modifications boosted output from the standard 60 horsepower to somewhere between 85 and 90. Not enough to compete with modern tractors in raw power, but substantially more than the Farmall's appearance suggested. Gary and Kenneth had spent 3 days going through every system, documenting what they found, understanding what they had. Gary had advised keeping it quiet. County assessor might revalue your equipment if word gets out about performance modifications. Property taxes could increase. Kenneth had agreed partly for practical reasons and partly because he didn't need attention. They'd tuned the engine to run conservatively during normal work, saving fuel and reducing wear. The Farmall pulled plows and cultivators with the same steady reliability it had shown for 18 years. Kenneth saw no reason to broadcast its capabilities until Donald Thompson stood in the staging area offering $500 cash to buy the Farmall as a barn decoration. His voice loud enough for 30 competitors to hear his laughter cutting through the afternoon heat. The morning had started differently. Kenneth had arrived at the registration table at 7:30, the fairgrounds still quiet, except for 4-H kids preparing livestock exhibits. Rebecca Clark worked the registration desk, 38 years old, had known Kenneth since grade school, when they'd sat 2 rows apart in Mrs. Henderson's 3rd grade class. She'd looked up from her clipboard when Kenneth approached, surprise evident in her expression. "Kenneth, you're entering the poll, the open class." He'd nodded, counting out $25 in bills. Rebecca had glanced past him toward the parking area where the Farmall sat on a trailer, rust streaks visible even at 50 yards. "You know what you're up against. Donald Thompson's got that new Deere. Must have cost him $50,000. I know." Kenneth's voice carried no concern, no bravado, just acknowledgement. "That tractor's 18 years old." Rebecca's concern had been genuine, the worry of someone watching a friend walk toward embarrassment. "Runs fine." Kenneth had signed the entry form, taken his number 8 position card, walked back to his truck without elaboration. Donald had arrived at 9 o'clock, impossible to miss. His John Deere 4440 came in on a custom trailer, the tractor gleaming from a morning wash and wax. 3 men from Donald's operation had spent 2 hours that morning preparing it for display, treating the competition like a showroom demonstration. The 4440 carried 47 hours on its odometer, purchased 8 weeks earlier in June from the dealership in Waterloo. The sticker price had been $47,500, financed through the bank at $890 monthly for 6 years. The specifications read like advertising copy. Turbocharged 466 cubic inch diesel engine, 130 horsepower, rated 145 at peak. Power shift transmission with 16 speeds, factory air conditioning, tinted glass, AM/FM radio in the cab. New Firestone 18.4-38 rear tires that cost more than some farmers spent on equipment in a year. The 4440 represented the pinnacle of agricultural engineering in 1979 technology and power, wrapped in green paint and chrome. Donald had worn a new Stetson hat for the occasion, starched shirt, despite the August heat, those expensive boots polished to a shine. A small crowd had gathered as the 4440 rolled off the trailer, people admiring the machine the way they'd admire a show car. Donald had stood beside it, answering questions, explaining features, making sure everyone understood what $47,000 bought. He'd spotted Kenneth's Farmall around 10:30, walking the staging area with the confidence of someone who owned the space. The moment Donald saw that rusted 560-something shifted in his expression. Amusement mixed with contempt opportunity presenting itself. "I didn't know they were running antique shows today." Donald's voice had carried across the staging area loud enough for 30 people to hear. A few competitors had laughed. Most had looked uncomfortable, recognizing the cruelty beneath the humor. Kenneth had been checking oil level, his attention focused on the dipstick, not responding to the provocation. Donald had circled the Farmall, slowly making a performance of his examination. He'd kicked one of the rear tires, shaken his head at the bailing wire, holding the fender, run his finger along the rust-streaked hood. Every gesture calculated for maximum visibility, every expression designed to diminish what he saw. "You know what this is worth, Kenneth. Maybe $200 as scrap metal?" Larry White had been standing nearby, a farmer from 3 miles west, who worked 320 acres with a 10-year-old Oliver tractor. Donald had turned to him, seeking validation for the joke. "How much did that cab cost on my 4440? About $12,000. Climate control, sound dampening, the whole package." Larry's response had carried an edge that Donald missed. "Must be nice." Donald had pulled out his wallet, then counting 5 $100 bills with the deliberate slowness of someone making a point. "Tell you what, Kenneth, I'll give you $500 cash for this tractor right now. You can walk away, save yourself the embarrassment, and I'll have something interesting to put in my barn." Kenneth had looked up from checking tire pressure, his face impossible to read. "Not for sale." Not for sale? Donald's disbelief had been genuine. "In 2 hours this thing won't be worth the diesel in the tank. You'll be lucky to drive it home." "We'll see. Pride makes men do stupid things." The wise ones recognize the edge and step back. Donald Thompson had spent 23 years running toward edges, convinced his money and success made him invincible. Margaret Thompson had arrived from the craft building around 11, carrying a ribbon her quilting had won, pleased with the small victory, until she saw her husband taunting Kenneth Anderson in front of a growing audience. She'd pulled Donald aside, her voice low but urgent. "Don, stop this. You're being cruel." His dismissal had been automatic. "I'm making a point." "What point? That you have more money?" Margaret had been married to Donald for 26 years, long enough to see the pattern that started after his father died. Long enough to watch ambition curdle into obsession, success become performance achievement, turn hollow. Donald had walked away from his wife without answering, returning to the staging area where Kenneth continued his quiet preparations. The public bet had emerged from frustration. Kenneth's refusal to react, to acknowledge Donald's superiority, to show any indication that he understood his place in the county hierarchy, that silence had been gasoline on smoldering resentment. Donald had needed Kenneth to recognize defeat, before the competition even started. When Kenneth wouldn't give him that, Donald escalated. "You know what, I'll make this interesting." Donald's voice had risen above the ambient noise, drawing attention from 50 people scattered across the staging area. Checkbook emerged from his pocket, expensive leather cover embossed with his initials. $10,000 says that piece of junk doesn't make it halfway down the track. The staging area had gone quiet. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned to stare. $10,000 was serious money in Buchanan County, Iowa, where the median household income hovered around $14,000 annually. Donald was betting more than half what most families earned in a year. Kenneth had looked at Donald, then at the checkbook, his expression unchanging. The pause stretched long enough that people started wondering if he'd respond at all. "I'll take that bet." 4 words that changed everything. The crowd's reaction had been immediate, a collective gasp followed by rising murmurs. Some people had laughed the nervous laughter that comes from watching someone do something monumentally foolish. Margaret Thompson's hand had covered her mouth, horror and embarrassment washing over her in equal measure. Brandon Thompson had arrived from the parking lot at that exact moment, 22 years old, home for the summer from Iowa State University, where he studied agricultural economics. He'd heard his father's announcement from 30 yards away, watched Kenneth accept, felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Dad, what are you doing?" Donald had been grinning, confident already, counting the money in his mind. He'd pulled out a piece of paper, writing quickly, "I owe you $10,000 to Kenneth Anderson if Farmall 560 beats John Deere 4440 in Buchanan County. Fair Tractor Pull Finals August 18, 1979. His signature went at the bottom, bold and certain. He'd handed the paper to Rebecca Clark, who'd been standing nearby with her clipboard. "You're my witness, Rebecca. Make sure everyone knows this is official." Rebecca had taken the paper reluctantly. "Donald, are you absolutely sure about this?" "Never been more sure of anything in my life." 53 witnesses watched Donald Thompson sign that paper. Not one of them thought Kenneth had a chance. The betting seemed like highway robbery, Donald taking money from a man who couldn't afford to lose it. Except Gary Young, who'd been standing in the back of the crowd, had allowed himself a small smile. Gary knew what sat under that Farmall's hood. He'd helped Kenneth tune it that morning, advancing the fuel mixture 2 clicks, unleashing performance that had been deliberately restrained for 8 years. The tractor pull rules were simple but demanding. Each tractor pulled a weighted sled down a 300-foot dirt track. The sled used a progressive transfer mechanism, weight shifting forward as it moved, increasing resistance with every foot traveled. Whoever pulled the sled farthest won their round. A full pull meant reaching the 300-foot mark with the sled still moving. Top 8 distances advanced to finals, where an additional 2,000 pounds got added to the sled. Top 4 from finals competed for championship. First place paid $500 and a trophy. 15 tractors had entered the open class, representing serious iron from 3 counties. 2 case tractors, both modified for competition, carrying 150 and 165 horsepower respectively. An international harvester 1466 with 135 horsepower, a regular competitor who'd placed second last year, a Massey Ferguson 155 pushing 140 horsepower. Oliver John Deere, Alice Chalmers, Ford White Minneapolis, Moline Versatile. Every major manufacturer represented. Kenneth's Farmall 560, rated at 60 horsepower on paper, was the oldest tractor in the lineup by 11 years and the smallest by any measure. The draw had placed Kenneth at position 8, middle of the pack. Donald drew position 12 late enough to watch most competitors before his turn. Good positioning for strategy, terrible positioning for nerves. By 2 o'clock, the grandstands had filled to capacity. 2,147 people counted by the gate attendants, standing room only, every seat claimed. The temperature had climbed to 89 degrees humidity at 68%, making the air thick enough to taste. Diesel exhaust from warming engines mixed with smells from the livestock barns, fried food from concession stands, dust kicked up from the parking areas. The American flag hung limp atop the announcer's booth. No wind to move it. The first 7 pulls had set the competitive standard. Case 1370 had managed 223 feet respectable, but not championship level. The International Harvester 1466 had posted a full pull 300 feet, with the sled still moving, drawing huge cheers from the crowd. Massey Ferguson had reached 268 feet. The second case tractor, the 1570 with 165 horsepower, had also achieved a full pull, confirming this competition would be fierce. Oliver managed 245 feet. Another John Deere, a 443, had pulled to 287 feet, just 13 feet short of perfect. The Alice Chalmers had reached 251, 2 full pulls before position 8 even competed. The crowd energy had been building with each successful run, people on their feet for the full pulls groaning sympathetically when tractors stalled short of the mark. At 4:05, Gary Young had found Kenneth beside his truck, the Farmall already unloaded and warmed up. Gary had opened the engine compartment, both men checking systems one final time. "You gonna show them what she's got?" Gary's question had been rhetorical. He already knew the answer. Kenneth had been making the adjustment they had discussed, advancing the fuel mixture from its conservative setting to full performance. The change was small, 2 clicks on a calibrated screw, but it unlocked the engine's complete potential. For 8 years, Kenneth had run this tractor at partial capacity, saving fuel and reducing wear during normal work. Today required everything the test mule modifications could deliver. That's where you want it. Gary had watched Kenneth's hands work through familiar movements, grease under the fingernails, calluses earned from decades of physical labor. That's where we need it. A brief flashback had crossed Kenneth's mind, memory triggered by the feel of the engine components. His father, Robert Anderson, teaching a 17-year-old Kenneth to drive this same tractor in the summer of 1962. The Farmall had been new, then fresh red paint, gleaming Robert's pride, showing through normally reserved demeanor. The old man's hands guiding Kenneth's on the controls, voice patient, as he explained how to feel what the engine was telling you, how to listen for changes in sound that indicated problems, how to respect equipment, and it would respect you back. Take care of your machinery, and when it matters most, it'll take care of you. Robert's philosophy, proven across 30 years of farming passed down to his son like an inheritance more valuable than land. Kenneth had closed the engine compartment, wiped his hands on the red bandana he carried in his back pocket, nodded to Gary. Ready. Meanwhile, Donald had been sitting in the air-conditioned cab of his 4440, reading the instruction manual for the third time. The tractor intimidated him slightly. All this technology and power, so many systems to understand. He'd owned it for 8 weeks and still discovered new features. Margaret had brought him iced tea from the concession stand, trying once more to reach past his certainty. Are you really doing this? Already done. I'll win my pull, collect 10,000 from Kenneth, maybe buy him dinner with his own money. Donald's confidence had been absolute, the kind of certainty that comes from never having been seriously challenged. You're going to humiliate a decent man who never hurt anyone. I'm teaching this county about quality, about investing in the best. Donald's self-justification had been practiced, a speech he'd given himself repeatedly over the years, every time someone questioned his spending. Margaret had walked away, unable to watch what was coming. At 4:15, the announcer's voice had crackled through the PA system carrying across the fairgrounds. Next up, number 8, Kenneth Anderson on a 1962 Farmall 560. Scattered applause had greeted the announcement, mixed with some chuckles from people who'd heard about Donald's bet. Kenneth had climbed onto the Farmall movements, practiced and economical, no wasted motion. The engine had started on the first crank, catching immediately with a deep rumble that surprised the few people paying attention. Old tractors usually required multiple attempts, especially in August heat. This one fired like a brand-new machine. Donald had been watching from his staging position, close enough to see far enough to maintain distance. When the Farmall's engine caught so easily, something had flickered in his expression, the first hairline crack in absolute certainty. Kenneth had let the engine warm for 45 seconds, listening to its rhythm, feeling the vibration through the seat-checking gauges one final time. Then he'd eased the clutch out, driving forward to where officials waited to hook the sled. The track judge had raised the green flag. Kenneth's hand had moved to the throttle. The crowd had leaned forward, 247 people, suddenly interested in watching the old Farmall that had no business competing against modern equipment. At 4:18 p.m. on August 18, 1979, Kenneth Anderson proved that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the biggest surprise. The Farmall's rear tires bit into dirt. The sled lurched forward, and the real education of Donald Thompson began. The first 100 feet looked ordinary. Kenneth eased the clutch out, the Farmall moving forward with steady purpose, the sled's weight pulling against the hitch. 60% throttle, conserving power, letting the engine find its rhythm. The rear tires threw small divots of dirt, nothing dramatic, just a working tractor doing what tractors do. The crowd watched with mild interest, expecting exactly what they saw. At 150 feet, something changed. Kenneth opened the throttle to 75%. The engine's note shifted from steady rumble to aggressive growl, a sound too deep and powerful for a standard 60-horsepower machine. Black smoke began puffing from the exhaust stack. Not the white smoke of a struggling engine, but the dense carbon output of a diesel running rich and strong. The rear tires dug deeper into the track, throwing dirt in twin rooster tails that arced 4 feet behind the tractor. People in the grandstand started sitting up straighter. Larry White, standing with the other competitors, leaned forward slightly. "That don't sound like 60 horses." 200 feet. Kenneth pushed the throttle to 90%. The Farmall's engine was screaming now, a sound that made heads turn across the fairgrounds, penetrating conversations and drawing attention from people who'd been half watching while eating funnel cakes or checking livestock exhibits. The exhaust stack shot thick black smoke in pulsing clouds, the kind of output that comes from massive fuel consumption from an engine working at absolute capacity. Someone in the crowd yelled above the noise, "What the hell kind of 560 is that?" Donald Thompson stood frozen at position 12, his confident smirk evaporating like water on August asphalt. The Farmall kept pulling, 225 feet, 250. The sled was getting heavier with every foot weight, transferring forward resistance, increasing exponentially. Kenneth's tractor should have been stalling by now, wheels spinning uselessly, engine choking under load it couldn't handle. Instead, at 270 feet, Kenneth opened the throttle completely. Full power, everything the test mule modifications could deliver. The engine's scream reached a pitch that vibrated through the grandstand bleachers, rattling loose boards, making the metal roof sheeting buzz. The rear tires were churning trenches now, throwing so much dirt that a brown dust cloud obscured the tractor from certain angles. The entire Farmall frame shook visibly, fenders blurring from vibration, the steering wheel alive in Kenneth's hands. The announcer's voice cracked through the PA system, disbelief overriding professional neutrality. "Folks, I don't believe what I'm seeing. 280 feet, 285, 290. The crowd was on its feet now, all 2,147 people standing, many of them screaming, pointing, grabbing the person next to them to make sure they were witnessing the same impossible thing. The old Farmall, the rusted scrap heap that Donald Thompson had offered $500 for as a joke, was pulling a full load toward the 300-foot line with power that rivaled tractors 3 times its rated horsepower. Kenneth's knuckles showed white against the steering wheel, his entire body leaning forward as if his weight could add momentum. The Farmall crossed 295 feet. The front wheels lifted slightly with each power surge, the nose rising and falling in rhythm with the engine's fury. 298 feet, 299. The Farmall crossed the 300-foot line with the sled still moving. Full pull. The crowd erupted. The sound was physical, a wall of noise that rolled across the fairgrounds, 247 people on their feet screaming, clapping, jumping, hugging strangers, waving hats and programs in the air. Full pull. Did you see that? That old Farmall just went 300. The grandstand shook from collective celebration, decades of collective experience, telling every farmer present that what they'd just witnessed shouldn't have been possible. Rebecca Clark stood with her clipboard hand over her mouth, shaking her head slowly. She'd known Kenneth since 3rd grade, watched him farm those 280 acres with equipment everyone considered barely adequate, never heard him boast about anything. Now his rusty, dented baling wire-held together Farmall had just posted a full pull in open class competition, and Rebecca felt something shift in her understanding of what quiet competence actually meant. Brandon Thompson watched his father's face drain from ruddy confidence to ash-pale shock in the span of 3 seconds. The transformation was complete and terrible, like watching a building's foundation crack in real time. Margaret stood beside her son, one hand gripping his arm, the other pressed against her chest, where her heart hammered against her ribs. Kenneth drove the Farmall back to the staging area, the engine settling into its normal idle. That aggressive scream fading to the familiar rumble that had characterized 18 years of fieldwork. He shut off the ignition with a simple twist of the key, climbed down from the seat, with the same economical movements he'd used, climbing up, walked to the water cooler without looking at anyone, poured himself a paper cup of lukewarm water, drank it slowly. Gary Young met him there, away from the crowd's attention. Their handshake lasted 3 seconds. No words exchanged, just the shared smile of men who'd kept a secret for 8 years and finally had reason to reveal it. Gary's grin was huge, unrestrainable. Kenneth's expression remained neutral, professional, giving nothing away to the spectators trying to read his reaction. Donald Thompson stood 30 feet away, completely still except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest. His mind scrambled for explanation, for logic, for any framework that made sense of what he'd just witnessed. That tractor was 18 years old. Kenneth Anderson was nobody, a small farmer with limited resources, someone Donald had categorized and dismissed years ago. How was this possible? Margaret approached her husband carefully, the way someone might approach a wounded animal. "Don!" He cut her off with a sharp gesture. "Not now!" The crowd noise gradually settled as the next tractor prepared to pull. Position 9, an International Harvester, 1-456, with 130 horsepower, managed a respectable 276 feet before stalling. Good enough to likely make finals, not good enough to match Kenneth's full pull. Position 10, a Ford TW 20, pushing 145 horsepower, reached 291 feet, agonizingly close to the mark, but falling 9 feet short. Position 11, a white 135, stalled at 264 feet. Then Donald's turn arrived. Position 12. The announcer called his name. Donald Thompson on a 1979 John Deere 4440. The newest tractor in competition, the most expensive by $20,000, representing everything modern agricultural engineering could achieve. Donald climbed into the air-conditioned cab with hands that trembled slightly, the first time he'd felt genuine nervousness in years. The leather seat embraced him. The tinted glass cut the glare. The instrument panel displayed more information than some farm trucks had total gauges. 130 horsepower waited at his command. Turbocharged diesel power backed by hydraulic sophistication and transmission technology that cost more than Kenneth Anderson's entire tractor. Donald started the engine. The 4440 came to life with smooth, refined power. Nothing like the Farmall's raw scream, but impressive in its own way, the sound of precision engineering and quality components working in harmony. He pulled forward to the sled officials, hooking the weighted load to his hitch track, Judge raising the green flag. Donald hit the throttle. The John Deere launched forward with authority. 100 feet came quickly, the 4440, pulling with confidence, technology, doing exactly what $47,500 promised. 150 feet, 200 feet. The crowd watched, appreciative of the performance, but not surprised. This was what a brand-new top-tier tractor should do. The 4440 made Kenneth's Farmall pull look like an anomaly, a fluke, something that couldn't be repeated. 250 feet, 275. Donald's confidence was rebuilding. The 4440 had power to spare, pulling strong, showing no signs of struggle. He'd tie Kenneth's full pull, maybe exceed. He'd prove that quality and investment ultimately mattered more than whatever lucky modifications Kenneth had stumbled into. 285 feet, 290. The crowd leaned forward. Could Donald match Kenneth's full pull? Would the day's first shocking result be followed immediately by its negation? The John Deere 440 crossed the 300-foot line with 20 feet of sled movement still visible. Full pull, easily, powerfully, exactly as designed. The crowd cheered recognition of excellent performance, even if it lacked the dramatic surprise of Kenneth's run. Donald felt relief flood through him like cool water. He'd matched the Farmall. The bet remained alive, but no longer seemed like certain loss. Finals would decide everything, where an additional 2,000 pounds would separate pretenders from champions, where his superior equipment would prove its worth. He climbed down from the cab, trying to recapture his earlier swagger, trying to project the confidence he'd displayed before Kenneth's pull. But something had changed in how people looked at him. The smirks were gone, replaced by assessment, by calculation, by the dawning realization that Donald Thompson might actually lose this bet. Positions 13 through 15 completed their pulls. The Case 2470, carrying 170 horsepower, managed 295 feet, agonizingly close, but 5 feet short. The versatile 835 reached 282 feet. The Minneapolis Moline stalled at 288. Rebecca Clark posted the official qualifying results on the scoreboard. 8 tractors advanced to finals. Kenneth Anderson's Farmall 560 with a full pull. The International Harvester won 466 with a full pull. The Case 1570 with a full pull. Donald Thompson's John Deere 4440 with a full pull. The Case 2470 at 295 feet. The Ford TW 20 at 291 feet. The Minneapolis Moline at 288. The John Deere 4430 at 287 feet. 4 full pulls. 4 tractors tied for first place going into championship rounds. The announcer declared a 30-minute break before finals, giving competitors time to check equipment and the grounds crew time to prepare the track. Margaret found Brandon near the concession stand, away from the crowd's attention. Her son stood with shoulders tight, jaw clenched, watching his father accept congratulations from people who didn't know about the bet or chose to ignore its implications. "Mom, did you see Dad's face during Kenneth's pull?" Brandon's voice carried concern that went beyond the immediate competition. "I saw." Margaret had been married to Donald for 26 years, long enough to recognize the patterns to understand how her husband's mind worked when challenged. He's trapped now, tied going into finals. If he loses... Brandon didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Margaret reached into her purse, pulled out a folded document she'd found in Donald's office 2 weeks earlier while looking for property tax records. She'd been carrying it since, trying to decide what to do with the information, whether confronting Donald would help or make things worse. "I found this last week." She handed it to Brandon. He unfolded the paper, scanned the first page, felt his stomach drop. Purchase and sale agreement. Patterson Farm, 400 acres. Purchase price $1,080,000. Buyer, Donald J. Thompson, financing 100% bank loan variable rate, starting at 11.5%. Closing date, October 15, 1979. The document had Donald's signature at the bottom, dated July 23rd, nearly a month ago. "Mom, this is—" Brandon's economics training kicked in, numbers running automatically. "This is over $1 million at variable rate, with land prices already at peak." "I know." Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. His professor at Iowa State had spent 3 weeks on the farm, crisis building across rural America. Interest rates climbing, Federal Reserve tightening money supply to fight inflation, land values that had tripled during the 1970s showing signs of topping out, farmers who'd borrowed heavily during the boom years facing adjustable rate resets that doubled their debt service. The professor had been explicit. The agricultural economy was approaching a cliff, and farmers, leveraged to the maximum, would be the first to fall. Does he understand what happens if interest rates go up another 5 points? Brandon did the math quickly. $1 million loan at 16% instead of 11.5. The difference was $45,000 annually, just in additional interest. Your father doesn't listen to economists or wives or anyone who suggests he might be wrong about something. Margaret folded the document, put it back in her purse. "He signed this a month ago. Didn't tell me. Didn't ask Brandon's opinion. Didn't consult with anyone. Why would he buy more land right now?" Brandon struggled to find logic in the decision. Because Kenneth Anderson beat him at something. Because people saw. Because your father's spent 23 years proving he's the biggest and the best, and the thought of being surpassed by a quiet farmer with old equipment threatens everything he's built his identity on. Margaret understood her husband better than he understood himself, saw the wound that drove him even if she couldn't heal it. 50 yards away, Larry White was having a similar conversation with other farmers near the grandstand. The sentiment had shifted dramatically in 30 minutes. Before Kenneth's pull, most competitors had viewed Donald's bet as mean-spirited, but expected Donald to collect his money. Now sentiment had swung hard in Kenneth's direction. "Donald's got 2,200 acres. Let Kenneth have this one." The speaker was a farmer from Independence who worked 600 acres and struggled every year to make payments. Been waiting years for someone to knock Thompson down a peg. This from a dairy farmer who'd borrowed equipment from Donald twice and received lectures both times about proper maintenance and investment in quality machinery. The undercurrent of class resentment was surfacing, years of accumulated frustration with Donald's condescension and displays of wealth, finding outlet in support for the underdog. These farmers had watched Donald parade new equipment, acquire more land, sit on every important board, all while making them feel small for not matching his scale. Kenneth's unexpected performance gave them something they'd craved without realizing how much they wanted it, the satisfaction of seeing the biggest man in the county face genuine challenge. Stephen Taylor sat in the VIP section, a shaded area with better seating reserved for fair sponsors and local officials. The bank president was 55 years old, 30 years in agricultural lending survivor of the 1950s farm downturn when he'd been a young loan officer watching families lose generations of accumulated land. He'd learned lessons then about leverage, about the danger of assuming prices always rose, about how quickly prosperity could invert into catastrophe when interest rates spiked and commodity prices dropped simultaneously. Stephen had Donald Thompson's file effectively memorized. The 4,440 loan 47,500 at 12% monthly payment $890. Existing land loans 845,000 outstanding from previous expansions. Operating line of credit 125,000 with 80% currently drawn. The new Patterson purchase pending $1,080,000 at variable rate. Total exposure over $2 million. Collateral land currently valued around $2.4 million based on recent comparable sales at roughly $2,600 per acre. On paper, the ratios looked acceptable, loan to value around 83%. Donald's cash flow historically covered debt service with room to spare. But Stephen had been reviewing national economic indicators, reading Federal Reserve statements, talking to correspondent bankers in Chicago and Des Moines. The whispers were getting louder. Interest rates would likely hit 15% by year end, possibly 18% within 2 years. Prime rate could touch 20. If that happened, if Donald's variable rate loans reset at those levels, his debt service would climb from roughly $200,000 annually to over $350,000, and land values were softening. Nothing dramatic yet, just a slowing of appreciation, fewer buyers at auctions, properties sitting unsold longer than expected. Stephen had seen this pattern before. The top of the market looked exactly like the middle of the boom, until suddenly it didn't. Until one day you realized you'd passed the peak 3 months ago and gravity was asserting itself. Stephen watched Donald Thompson standing beside his $47,000 tractor, watched Kenneth Anderson calmly preparing for finals, and thought about risk assessment and the human tendency to confuse a winning streak with invincibility. He'd approved Donald's loans because the numbers justified approval, but numbers were backward-looking. They told you what had worked, not what would work. 2 grain buyers from Chicago stood near Stephen, men he knew from agricultural conferences, representatives from companies that purchased corn and soybeans from Iowa farmers and shipped them worldwide. Their conversation drifted to him, heard the feds raising rates again, maybe to 15 by December, won't stop there. Volcker's serious about breaking inflation. We could see 18, even 20 before this is done. What's that do to farmers? The ones leveraged heavy? They're finished. Land bought at peak prices with variable rate debt. That's a death sentence when rates double. Stephen had felt cold despite the August heat. Donald Thompson had just signed for another $1 million in variable rate debt. If the Fed pushed rates to where these buyers expected Donald would be underwater within 2 years, collateral worth less than outstanding loans, cash flow insufficient to cover debt service. But confronting Donald about it would accomplish nothing. Stephen had tried subtly suggesting restraint when Donald applied for the Patterson loan. The response had been dismissive. I've been farming successfully for 30 years. I think I understand my business better than someone who's never planted a seed. The 30-minute break ended. The announcer called finalists to the staging area. Finals would add 2,000 pounds to the sled, bringing total weight to 8,500 pounds. This was where pretenders separated from champions, where equipment limitations revealed themselves, where driver skill and tractor capability combined to produce results that couldn't be faked. The crowd had swelled during the break, word spreading through the fairgrounds that something special was happening at the tractor pull. People abandoned other exhibits, left the midway attractions, gathered at the grandstand until standing room disappeared, and spectators lined the fence 3 deep. The first 4 finalists pulled respectable distances that would have been championship level in normal years. The John Deere 4430 managed 235 feet under the heavier load. Strong performance from a tractor not quite in the top tier. The Minneapolis Moline reached 251 feet driver skill, extracting maximum capability from good equipment. The Ford TW 20 stalled at 247 feet. The Case 24701, of the most powerful tractors competing, pulled to 268 feet, setting the mark everyone else needed to beat. Then Kenneth's turn arrived. Gary Young had spent the break checking every system on the Farmall tightening connections that didn't need tightening, verifying settings that hadn't changed, giving his hands something to do while his mind calculated probabilities. The qualifying pull had pushed the Farmall to its limits. Adding 2,000 pounds meant asking for performance beyond what the test mule modifications were designed to deliver. She's tuned perfect. Just drive like you know how. Gary's confidence was genuine, but not absolute. They were operating in unknown territory now. Kenneth nodded, climbed onto the Farmall for the second time that afternoon. The seat felt familiar, 17 years of use molding the metal to his shape. He'd driven this tractor across every acre of his 280 acres, multiple times plowed and cultivated, and harvested pulled wagons, and lifted bales, and done 10,000 ordinary tasks that created relationship between operator and machine. The Farmall knew his hands. He knew its sounds, its vibrations, the subtle language it spoke through steering wheel feedback and engine note changes. Officials hooked the 8,500-pound sled to the Farmall's hitch. The weight differential was immediately visible, the tractor's nose rising slightly from the downward pull, rear tires compressing. This was substantially more resistance than any pull Kenneth had attempted during field work. The test mule modifications gave him extra power, but physics remained physics. Weight multiplied by distance required energy, and eventually, every engine reached the point where no amount of throttle produced forward movement. The track judge raised the green flag. Kenneth released the clutch smoothly, feeling the Farmall lurch against massive resistance. 70% throttle from the start, no gentle buildup this time. The engine roared immediately, black smoke pouring from the exhaust stack rear tires, biting deep and throwing dirt in heavy streams. The crowd noise rose with the engine sound. 247 people focused absolutely on the rusty Farmall fighting 8,500 pounds of sled. 75 feet came slowly, the tractor straining against load that seemed almost animate in its resistance. Kenneth pushed throttle to 85%. The engine scream filled the fairgrounds, drowning conversation, making the grandstand structure vibrate in sympathy. 100 feet, 125. The Farmall was shaking violently, every bolt and rivet and weld stressed beyond design specifications. At 150 feet, Kenneth opened the throttle completely, full power, everything the modified engine could generate. The sound reached levels that hurt ears. that made children cover their heads, that sent vibration through the ground itself. The rear tires were smoking from friction rubber heating against dirt, creating dual trails of haze that rose behind the tractor. 200 feet, 225. Kenneth's face showed absolute concentration, reading feedback from steering wheel and seat and sound, making micro-adjustments to throttle position, shifting his weight forward to add traction to rear wheels, every ounce of his farming experience deployed in service of keeping the Farmall moving forward. At 250 feet, the tractor looked ready to tear itself apart. The front end lifted repeatedly, bouncing against the weight that pulled downward through the hitch. The engine note fluctuated, racing, then catching racing, then catching fighting for traction and power simultaneously. Kenneth could feel components reaching their breaking point, metal stressed to maximum heat, building in bearings and pistons, everything right at the edge. 260 feet, 270. The crowd was screaming continuously now, a sustained roar of encouragement and disbelief. Kenneth backed off throttle 5%, let the engine find sustainable power, then hammered throttle again. The surge caught the sled mid-resistance, moved it forward 8 feet before momentum died. 280 feet, 283. The wheels were spinning more than gripping now, the tractor fighting for every inch. Kenneth kept pressure constant, refusing to give up, maintaining belief that the next second would produce the grip needed for another foot of progress. At 287 feet, the Farmall's engine stalled. The rear wheels locked the sled, stopped moving, absolute silence falling across the fairgrounds as the engine died. Kenneth sat motionless for 3 seconds, hands still gripping the wheel, then released his breath and shut off the fuel. 287 feet. Best distance of the championship round so far, 12 feet better than the case, 2470. The crowd erupted again, recognizing that the old Farmall had just set the mark that everyone else needed to beat. Kenneth drove back to the staging area on the starter motor, the engine warm enough that restarting might risk damage. Gary met him at the trailer bay, split by enormous grin hand extended for a shake that turned into a brief hug. 287 with 8,500 pounds. The Farmall had delivered everything they'd hoped, and more, proving that sometimes quiet preparation and understanding your equipment mattered more than purchasing power. Donald Thompson was next. Position 12 in the original draw meant position 4 in the finals after other tractors were eliminated. He climbed into the 444 Ohus cab with the weight of 2,147 witnesses pressing against him, the $10,000 bet sitting on his chest like physical mass. He had to beat 287 feet. Had to. Everything depended on it. Not just money, though. $10,000 was serious. But reputation standing the identity he'd constructed across 23 years of proving his worth to a dead father's memory. The John Deere started with refined power. Donald pulled to the sled officials, hooking the 8,500-pound load. The track judge's flag rose fell. Donald hit the throttle hard. The 4440 pulled strong from the start. 100 feet came cleanly, technology and horsepower combining exactly as engineering promised. 150 feet, 200 feet. The turbocharged diesel sang its sophisticated song, powered delivery, smooth and controlled, nothing like the Farmall's raw violence, but impressive in capability and refinement. 250 feet. The crowd watched with intense focus, doing mental math, comparing Donald's progress to Kenneth's earlier run. At 250 feet, both had been pulling strong. The question was whether the 4440 superior power would translate to superior distance. 260 feet, 270. Donald's confidence was rebuilding. The tractor had reserves, still power in hand, transmission responding perfectly. Just 18 more feet, less than the length of his living room. Easy distance for a $47,000 machine pulling against old iron that had no business competing. At 275 feet, something changed. The rear tires started slipping, losing traction in dirt that had been churned loose by previous pulls. Donald felt it through the steering wheel, the subtle difference between grip and slide. He throttled harder, trying to power through the slippage. The tires spun faster, throwing dirt and rooster tails that looked impressive but produced no forward movement. Donald's mind flooded with panic. He adjusted weight, shifted his position, tried different throttle positions. Nothing worked. The sled had stopped. The John Deere's wheels spun uselessly, all that horsepower converting to heat and noise instead of distance. 278 feet, 9 feet short of Kenneth's mark. The track judge waved the red flag after 20 seconds of no progress. "Donald, you're done. The official distance is 278. Donald sat in the air-conditioned cab engine, still running wheels, still spinning pointlessly, reality crashing over him in waves. He'd lost. The bet, the bragging rights, the validation he'd needed. Everything he'd been so certain of 30 minutes ago had inverted, transformed from sure victory into public defeat. He shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt accusatory. Through the tinted glass, he could see Margaret standing in the grandstand, one hand covering her mouth, Brandon's arm around her shoulders. He could see other farmers watching their expressions, ranging from sympathy to satisfaction to careful neutrality. He could see Rebecca Clark at the scoring table, writing down his distance, making it official. 278 feet. Donald Thompson, John Deere 4440, 9 feet short. The remaining two tractors pulled well, but couldn't match Kenneth's distance. The Case 1570 managed 265 feet, despite carrying 165 horsepower. The International Harvester 1466 came agonizingly close, reaching 283 feet, just 4 feet short of Kenneth's mark. Rebecca Clark posted the final results on the scoreboard, her handwriting careful and official. First place, Kenneth Anderson, Farmall 560, 287 feet. Second place, International Harvester 1466, 283 feet. Third place, Donald Thompson, John Deere 4440, 278 feet. Fourth place, Case 2470, 268 feet. The announcer's voice carried across the fairgrounds one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, your 1979 Buchanan County Open Class Champion, Kenneth Anderson. The crowd gave Kenneth a standing ovation that lasted 30 seconds. 2,147 people on their feet, acknowledging not just victory, but the stunning upset that had defined the afternoon. Kenneth walked to the winner's platform, accepted the trophy with a brief nod, took the $500 first-place check, shook hands with the fair president. No smile, no celebration, just quiet acceptance of what the competition had determined. Then he stepped down from the platform and walked directly toward Donald Thompson's truck. The crowd noise died immediately. Everyone saw where Kenneth was heading. Everyone knew what was coming. People froze mid-conversation, mid-bite of food, mid-step, watching the quiet farmer cross the staging area toward the man who'd humiliated him 4 hours earlier. Donald stood beside his truck, unable to move, watching Kenneth approach like a defendant watching a jury return to deliver verdict. Margaret and Brandon were 40 feet away, close enough to see but too far to intervene. Gary Young stayed by Kenneth's truck, giving his friend space to handle this alone. Stephen Taylor watched from the VIP section, understanding that he was about to witness the moment that would define both men for whatever came next. Kenneth stopped 5 feet from Donald. Their eyes met. The silence stretched so long that people started shifting uncomfortably. "I'll take that 10,000 now." Kenneth's voice was quiet but absolutely clear, carrying across the staging area in the dead stillness that had fallen. Donald's face flushed red, then pale, then red again. His jaw clenched so tight that muscles stood out along his neck. He looked at Kenneth, then at the crowd watching them, then back at Kenneth. For 10 seconds, maybe 15, he stood frozen, the internal war visible in his expression. Part of him wanted to refuse to claim the bet had been a joke to find some technicality that freed him from obligation. Part of him understood that welching on a public bet in front of 53 witnesses would destroy him more completely than paying ever could. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his checkbook, the expensive leather cover embossed with his initials that now seemed like grotesque ostentation. His hand shook as he opened it, positioned his pen, began to write. The date came first August 18th, 1979. The amount line required effort, his hand fighting him, not wanting to form the numbers that represented humiliation, made financial. $10,000, paid to the order of Kenneth Anderson. The memo line stared at him blank, demanding explanation for this payment context, for the check that would clear his account in 3 business days. Donald left it empty. No words existed that could frame this transaction in acceptable terms. His signature went at the bottom, practiced and familiar, but rendered in shaking script that looked nothing like his normal confident scrawl. Donald J. Thompson. He tore the check from the book with a sound that seemed too loud, held it out without raising his eyes to meet Kenneth's. Kenneth took the check, folded it once precisely, placed it in his shirt pocket. He nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that the transaction had completed. Then he turned and walked away without another word, no gloating, no smile, no additional humiliation piled onto defeat. Donald stood alone beside his $47,000 tractor, surrounded by people, but isolated by the moment that would define him from this day forward. Margaret reached him first, her hand gentle on his arm. "Let's go home." Her voice carried only sadness, no judgment, just the exhaustion of watching her husband destroy himself through pride. Donald couldn't respond. His throat had closed. His eyes burned with tears. He refused to shed publicly. Everyone saw. Everyone knows. The words repeated in his mind, blocking out everything else. They drove home in 20 minutes of absolute silence, Donald at the wheel, but seeing nothing, Margaret beside him, knowing that the man she'd married had just suffered the kind of wound that changed people fundamentally. Brandon followed in his own truck, his mind already working through implications and consequences, trying to calculate how this humiliation would affect his father's decision-making going forward. By sunset, the story had spread to every diner, gas station, and church basement in Buchanan County. Phone lines buzzed with retellings, details getting embellished, the upset growing larger with each iteration. Did you hear Kenneth Anderson's old Farmall beat Donald Thompson's brand new Deere? $10,000 Donald bet, right there in front of everyone. Lost by 9 feet. Had to pay Kenneth in front of the whole county. At the county diner that evening, the corner booth, usually reserved for Donald and other board members, sat empty. The joke had already started circulating, the catchphrase that would haunt him for months. "Hey, Donald won a bet on that." People said it with grins, repeating it until the words became reflex, transforming his name into shorthand for arrogant certainty, meeting unexpected defeat. Kenneth drove home as the sun touched the horizon trailer, carrying the Farmall that had just rewritten his life's story. Gary followed in his own truck, both men quiet, letting the day's events settle into memory. Kenneth pulled into his driveway, the white farmhouse small and unassuming against the darkening sky. He unloaded the Farmall, backed it into the barn, shut off the engine for the final time that day. The folded check sat in his pocket, $10,000 from a man who'd tried to humiliate him from a bet that had been meant to demonstrate Kenneth's irrelevance. He'd deposit it Monday morning at the First National Bank, where Stephen Taylor would process the transaction and make a quiet note in his files about Donald Thompson's judgment and Kenneth Anderson's capabilities. Kenneth walked to his house, the red bandana in his back pocket, still carrying grease stains from checking the Farmall's engine that morning. His father's philosophy echoed in his mind, words proven true by the afternoon's events. Take care of your equipment, and when it matters most, it'll take care of you. The rust hadn't mattered. The dents hadn't mattered. The baling wire holding the fender hadn't mattered. What mattered was understanding what you had, respecting its capabilities, knowing when to unleash power that others couldn't see. Kenneth had won more than money that afternoon. He'd won something Donald Thompson was about to lose completely, the respect of a community that had watched both men for decades, and finally seen which one possessed substance beneath surface. The real cost of Donald's bet wasn't $10,000. It was the beginning of an education in humility that would cost him everything he'd spent 23 years accumulating, teaching him lessons about pride and leverage and the difference between being the biggest and being the smartest. But that education wouldn't truly begin until October, when Donald would close on 400 acres he couldn't afford at interest rates about to spike, using borrowed money to prove a point to people who'd stopped listening. Monday morning, Kenneth deposited the check at First National Bank. The teller, a woman named Patricia, who'd worked there 15 years, recognized the amount and the signature before Kenneth said a word. Everyone in Buchanan County knew by now. She processed the transaction with professional neutrality, but her eyes carried questions she was too polite to ask. Kenneth requested the full amount go into his savings account, untouched, separate from operating funds. The money didn't feel like his. It felt like something he was meant to preserve, a marker of a lesson taught and learned. Stephen Taylor watched the transaction from his office door open, seeing Kenneth through the teller window. The bank president, made a quiet note in Donald Thompson's file, nothing official, just personal observation about judgment and consequence. Men who bet $10,000 on certainty were men who'd stopped questioning their assumptions. Stephen had learned across 3 decades in agricultural lending that the most dangerous borrowers weren't the ones struggling with debt. They were the ones convinced they couldn't fail. Donald didn't come to the bank that week, didn't come the next week. His account showed the check clearing on Wednesday, August 22nd, reducing his available balance by exactly $10,000. Stephen noted that too. The payment hadn't bounced, hadn't been contested, hadn't generated any follow-up from Donald requesting to discuss the matter. The humiliation had been absorbed in silence, no attempt to minimize or explain, just the money leaving his account and the story spreading through every conversation in the county. The diner on Main Street became ground zero for the joke's evolution. "Hey, Donald, want to bet on that?" The phrase appeared in multiple contexts daily. Someone uncertain about weather forecasts, someone questioning a football game, spread someone debating which seed corn variety to plant. The words attached themselves to Donald's name like rust eroding his carefully constructed reputation, one repetition at a time. By mid-September, Donald had stopped attending co-op meetings. His seat on the county board remained technically filled, but he sent a proxy to votes communicating through written statements rather than appearing in person. The Church Finance Committee received a letter requesting to be removed from membership, citing time constraints and personal matters. Nobody believed the excuse. Everyone understood he couldn't face the rooms where his authority had once gone unquestioned. Margaret watched her husband retreat into their farmhouse, like watching someone drown in slow motion. He spent hours in his office door closed, ostensibly reviewing account ledgers and planning next season's operations. But she heard no sound from behind that door. No scratch of pencil on paper, no phone calls being made or received. Just silence, the oppressive quiet of a man whose identity had been constructed around being the biggest and most successful, now forced to reconcile that construction with public defeat. Brandon returned to Iowa State in late August for fall semester, leaving reluctantly worried about his father's mental state. His agricultural economics classes had shifted focus to the changing rural economy professors discussing Federal Reserve policy and interest rate trends with increasing urgency. The numbers being projected made Brandon's stomach clench every time he thought about the Patterson Farm purchase agreement his mother had shown him. September turned to October. Grain harvest proceeded across Buchanan County, combines moving through cornfields, grain trucks hauling loads to elevators. Yields were good, better than average, which should have meant prosperity. Instead, prices were softening. Corn that had sold for $3.10 per bushel in March was bringing $2.85 in October. Soybeans down similarly. The mathematics of farming were shifting subtly, gross revenue declining while operating costs held steady or increased. Donald went through harvest motions mechanically, hiring the same crew he'd employed for years, running the same equipment, delivering loads to the same elevator. But neighbors noticed differences. The organization that usually characterized his operation seemed looser this year. Fields stayed uncut longer than optimal. Equipment sat idle for days between areas. Donald himself appeared less frequently in the fields, his presence diminished, his supervision sporadic. On October 12, 1979, Donald closed on the Patterson farm, 400 acres of prime farmland adjoining his existing holdings on the south boundary. The purchase price was $1,080,000, financed 100% through First National Bank. Stephen Taylor had presented the loan to his board with internal reservations he kept carefully masked. The numbers justified approval. Donald's existing collateral exceeded his debt by comfortable margins. Cash flow projections showed adequate coverage of the new debt service. But Stephen had also read the Federal Reserve's latest statement parsing the language about commitment to fighting inflation through monetary policy. Translation interest rates would continue climbing until inflation broke, regardless of economic consequences. The Patterson loan carried a variable rate starting at 11.5%, adjusting quarterly based on prime rate movement. If prime climbed to 15%, which Stephen considered likely within 18 months, Donald's interest on this single loan would jump from $124,000 annually to $162,000. The difference alone exceeded most farmers' entire annual income. Stephen had approved the loan anyway. His job was assessing risk based on current data, not predicting macroeconomic futures. And despite the tractor-pull humiliation, despite the behavioral changes neighbors reported, Donald Thompson's financial position remained technically sound. On paper, he could service this debt. On paper, the collateral covered the exposure. On paper, everything looked acceptable. Donald had signed the closing documents without reading them thoroughly. His attention elsewhere, his mind caught in loops of August 18th that replayed endlessly, despite every attempt to think about anything else. The Patterson acquisition brought his total holdings to 2,600 acres, making him the largest farmer in Buchanan County by acreage. The achievement that should have felt triumphant instead felt hollow compensation for something that couldn't be compensated, proof of something nobody was asking him to prove anymore. He drove home from the closing and told Margaret about the purchase in 3 sentences. "We bought the Patterson place, 400 acres, closes today." She'd stood in their kitchen dish towel in hands, feeling ice settle in her chest. Her voice had come out steady despite the fear. 400 acres we don't need and can't afford. We can afford it. Donald's response was automatic defensive, the words sounding false even as he spoke them. At what interest rate? When does it adjust? What happens if grain prices drop another 50 cents? Margaret's questions hit like hammer strikes each one, exposing weakness Donald didn't want to acknowledge. He'd walked out of the kitchen without answering, retreating to his office, closing the door against questions he had no good answers for. The agricultural economy shifted through 1980 like a ship changing course slow enough that individual moments seemed stable, fast enough that looking back showed dramatic transformation. In January, prime rate sat at 15%. By March, 16%. June brought 17.5%. By December 1980, prime rate had climbed to 21% levels, not seen since the Civil War rates that fundamentally altered the mathematics of farming. Donald's variable rate loans reset quarterly, each adjustment bringing payments higher. The Patterson loan climbed from 11.5% to 14 to 17 to 19.2. His monthly payment on that single loan increased from $10,300 to $16,700. The differential alone was $76,000 annually, money that had to come from somewhere, from operations that were generating less revenue as grain prices declined. Corn fell to $2.40 per bushel. Soybeans to $6 even. The combination of rising costs and falling revenue created a vice that tightened monthly, squeezing cash flow until Donald found himself making choices he'd never considered before. Delay equipment maintenance to make loan payments, skip fertilizer applications on marginal ground, reduce seed quality to save costs. Each compromise weakened his operation slightly, creating small vulnerabilities that would compound over time. By early 1981, farmland values had stopped rising. The boom that had tripled land prices during the 1970s simply halted buyers disappearing from auctions, properties selling for less than asking price when they sold at all. Donald's collateral, which had been valued at $2,600 per acre during the Patterson purchase, was now drawing offers around $2,200. On 2,600 acres, that represented a paper loss of over $1 million. Stephen Taylor began sending letters in late 1981, gentle at first, suggesting that Donald consider selling some non-essential acreage to reduce exposure, recommending conversation about restructuring debt. The letters went unanswered. Stephen escalated to phone calls. Donald's secretary said he was in the field, would return the call, never did. By mid-1982, Stephen was seriously concerned about the Thompson account, watching the collateral-to-debt ratio compress toward dangerous territory. The farm crisis that economists had predicted was no longer theoretical. Across Iowa, across the entire Midwest, foreclosures were accelerating. Properties that had been in families for generations went to auction, sold to banks or distant investors for fractions of what they'd been worth 3 years earlier. Equipment dealers went bankrupt. Small-town businesses closed. The social fabric of rural communities frayed as neighbors watched neighbors lose everything. Donald sold his John Deere 4440 in March 1983 for $18,000, less than 40% of what he'd paid 4 years earlier. The tractor had 4,200 hours on the odometer, maintained adequately, but not perfectly, showing the wear of a man whose attention had been elsewhere. He used the proceeds to make loan payments, buying himself another 3 months of survival. Then he sold the combine, the grain trucks, the newer tractors that still held some value. Everything that could be liquidated without stopping operations went to auction each sale, chipping away at the operation he'd spent decades building. He bought a used International 1066 for $6,800, 10 years old, but functional, capable of doing the work even if it lacked the features and power of what he'd sold. Climbing into that cab felt like stepping backward through time, giving up progress, admitting defeat in ways that had nothing to do with tractor pulls and everything to do with the fundamental trajectory of his life. Kenneth Anderson, meanwhile, weathered the farm crisis with the stability that came from zero debt. His revenue declined just like Donald's grain prices, affecting everyone equally. But Kenneth had no debt service consuming his income, no interest payments that adjusted quarterly, no loans requiring collateral worth more than outstanding balances. The $2,800 he'd paid for the Farmall in 1967 was long since depreciated to zero. The land his father had paid off in 1961 generated revenue without consuming it in payments. Kenneth reduced expenses during the crisis years, fixing equipment himself instead of hiring mechanics, buying used parts when possible, operating on margins that were thin but positive. He had the $10,000 from Donald's bet sitting in savings untouched since deposit earning interest that compounded quarterly. The account had grown to $11,400 by late 1983, money that served as cushion against crop failure or unexpected expenses, insurance against the kind of catastrophe that was destroying leveraged farmers across the region. Neighbors began asking Kenneth for advice quietly, at first embarrassed to admit they'd been wrong about the quiet farmer with old equipment. How do you make it work without borrowing? What's your strategy for low grain prices? Can you look at my tractor figure out if it's worth repairing? Kenneth helped when asked, sharing knowledge without judgment. Teaching the same principles his father had taught him: spend less than you make, fix what you have before buying new, treat debt like fire, useful in small amounts, but deadly if it gets loose. The respect Kenneth had earned on August 18, 1979, deepened through the crisis years. People saw that his approach, the conservative, boring strategy that Donald had mocked, was actually the wisdom that survived when conditions shifted. Being the biggest didn't matter when your debt exceeded your collateral. Having the newest equipment was irrelevant if you couldn't make payments. The metrics that Donald had optimized for turned out to be exactly wrong when the economy inverted. February 1985. Stephen Taylor made the phone call he'd been dreading for months. "Donald, we need to talk, in person, today, if possible." The bank president's voice carried weight that allowed no deflection. They met in Stephen's office at 2 o'clock, door closed. Secretary instructed to hold all calls. Stephen laid out spreadsheets that told the story in numbers. Total debt, $650,000. Collateral value, $380,000 based on recent comparable sales. Monthly debt service, exceeding available cash flow by $4,000. Operating lines maxed out with no additional credit available. The loan committee voted yesterday. Foreclosure proceedings begin next week. Auction scheduled for March 15th. Stephen delivered the information without inflection facts that couldn't be softened by tone or phrasing. Donald had sat across the desk, 59 years old, but looking 70, weight loss from stress, hair gone mostly gray, hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and fear. "Give me 30 days. I'll figure something out. You've had 5 years. I'm sorry, Donald. I tried to warn you. I tried to get you to restructure when it could have helped. You wouldn't return my calls." Stephen's frustration leaked through professional composure. Years of watching this disaster develop in slow motion, finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. Donald had left the bank without argument, driving home through winter landscape that seemed designed to match his internal devastation. Bare fields, gray sky temperature, hovering around freezing the world, stripped of color and warmth and hope. March arrived with the cruelty of false spring temperatures rising into the 50s, snow melting to reveal dead grass and mud, promising renewal that wouldn't come for the Thompson family. The foreclosure notice was delivered by sheriff's deputy on March 1st, official document, explaining procedures, timelines, rights, and obligations. Auction scheduled March 15th at 10 o'clock. All real property, including land, buildings, remaining equipment. Conducted by Farmers State Auction Company. proceeds to satisfy outstanding debt to First National Bank surplus, if any, to be returned to borrower. Donald had read the notice once, set it on his desk, stared at it for 3 hours without moving. 40 years of farming, 60 years of family legacy, 3 generations of accumulated land and reputation scheduled for public auction in 14 days. Margaret found him there at 6 o'clock, the office dark, except for desk lamp illuminating the foreclosure notice. She'd been crying on and off for weeks, mourning the loss in advance, grieving for the life she'd built, and the man she'd married, and the future that was being ripped away. She sat down in the chair across from Donald's desk, the same chair she'd sat in 1,000 times, discussing farm business planning expansions, making decisions together, back when Donald still listened to input. "We need to talk about what happens after." Her voice was steady, despite red eyes. "There is no after." Donald's response came from somewhere beyond exhaustion, beyond despair, from a place where hope had burned out completely. "Brandon's been applying for agricultural jobs. He might get something near here. We could rent a house in town. You could find work. It's not over." Margaret was fighting for survival, for practical steps forward, refusing to surrender to the gravity pulling them down. But Donald had surrendered weeks ago when Stephen Taylor's phone call made abstract fear into concrete reality. The auction would happen. The land would sell. The Thompson name would join the long list of families who'd lost everything during the farm crisis. His legacy would be humiliation, followed by failure. The joke about betting $10,000 followed by the foreclosure that proved the joke wasn't funny, it was prophecy. March 10th brought the auction company. 2 trucks and 4 workers posting signs at property corners, photographing buildings and equipment, preparing marketing materials for the sale. The signs were visible from the county road, impossible to miss, announcing Thompson Farm Auction to anyone driving past. Neighbors who'd known Donald for decades drove by, slowly looking, some with sympathy, some with the grim satisfaction of watching arrogance receive its accounting. Kenneth saw the signs on March 11th driving past Thompson property on his way to the feed mill. He'd known the foreclosure was coming. Everyone in the county knew the bank's actions being semi-public information that spread through the small-town network. But seeing the actual auction signs, the physical evidence of Donald's collapse, triggered something Kenneth hadn't expected: compassion. He thought about Donald's children, about Margaret, who'd never been anything but kind to him across 30 years of living in the same county, about the farmhouse that would be emptied, the legacy that would be scattered, the permanence of consequences that had started with $10,000 but had grown far beyond anything money could measure. That evening, Gary Young stopped by Kenneth's workshop, finding his friend working on a cultivator that needed welding before spring planting. They talked about equipment and weather and crop plans, the comfortable conversation of men who'd known each other 40 years. Eventually, Gary brought up what everyone was thinking about. "You going to the auction bid on any of that ground?" The question was practical, no judgment attached. The Thompson land was prime farmland, well located, properly drained. From pure business perspective, Kenneth could expand his operation significantly if prices came in right. "Been thinking about it." Kenneth shut off the welder, lifted his helmet, looked at Gary. "What Donald did to me, the way he treated people, I got a right to let him fall." "That's true. You got every right." Gary's agreement was simple acknowledgement of facts. What kind of man would that make me, though? Kenneth wiped his hands on a rag, the question rhetorical but genuine, testing his own conscience against circumstances. The same kind Donald was for 20 years. Gary's response was blunt. The world's got no shortage of people stepping on others while they're down. You want to be that person? Nobody would blame you after what he did. Kenneth thought about that through the night, lying awake, weighing justice against mercy, personal grievance against larger principles. His father had taught him that a man's value wasn't measured by what he took from others, but by what he gave when giving cost something. Robert Anderson had been speaking about helping neighbors during tough harvests, about sharing equipment when someone's broke down, about small generosities that built community. But the principle scaled. Donald Thompson had humiliated Kenneth publicly, had treated him like someone whose work and family legacy didn't matter, had bet $10,000 on that contempt like it was entertaining. Kenneth had every legal and moral right to stand back, let the auction happen, buy parcels at distressed prices if he wanted. The world would call that justice. But Kenneth had won that confrontation 4 years ago. He'd proven his point. Continuing to punish Donald accomplished nothing, except making Kenneth into the smaller man, the one who confused winning with destruction, who mistook having the high ground for needing to grind the defeated further into dirt. March 12th morning. Kenneth called Stephen Taylor at the bank, reaching him in his office before business hours opened. What would it take to stop the auction? Kenneth's question was direct, no preamble. Stephen had been surprised enough that silence lasted 5 seconds. Kenneth, is that you? How much does Donald owe? I can't discuss another customer's account details. Professional obligation overrode personal relationships, even conversations that might help. Stephen, we both know he owes somewhere around $650,000. Everyone in the county knows the general numbers. I'm asking specifically because I'm considering options. Kenneth's voice carried conviction that made Stephen reconsider standard protocols. The silence stretched longer this time. $648,530 as of this morning. But Kenneth, that's an enormous amount. What are you thinking? I'll be at the bank at 8. Kenneth hung up without elaboration. At 9 o'clock that same morning, Kenneth drove his 1968 Chevrolet pickup up the long driveway to Thompson Farmhouse, the first time he'd visited in 6 years. The house looked tired, paint peeling on north-facing siding shutters, slightly askew, the small deterioration that comes from deferred maintenance and defeated spirits. He parked near the equipment shed, walked to the front door, knocked. Margaret answered, eyes immediately showing surprise and confusion. Kenneth. Her voice carried questions she didn't know how to form. Morning, Margaret. I'd like to talk to Donald, if he's available. Kenneth's tone was formal, respectful, giving no indication of purpose. He's not really seeing anyone right now. Margaret's protective instinct overrode social convention. I understand. Just need a few minutes. Kenneth waited patiently, not pushing, letting her make the choice. She stepped aside, leading him through the house to Donald's office. The space looked like a command center, abandoned mid-battle papers, scattered across desk and floor coffee cups, unwashed curtains drawn against daylight. Donald sat in his chair, unshaven, wearing clothes he'd slept in, staring at nothing. When he saw Kenneth, something flickered in his expression, too complex to parse in single glance. Shame, anger, resignation, curiosity. His voice came out hoarse from disuse. Come to gloat. Kenneth shook his head, removing his cap. Came to talk. He sat in the chair across from Donald, without invitation. The chair where Margaret had sat weeks earlier, where business had been discussed, back when Donald's business still existed. I've got a proposition for you. Kenneth placed his cap on his knee, hands folded over it. Donald looked at him without comprehension, brain too exhausted to process what proposition could possibly exist 3 days before foreclosure auction. I'll pay off your bank loan, all of it. In exchange, you deed me 600 acres, the original Thompson land, what your grandfather bought. Kenneth delivered the offer calmly, watching Donald's face process information that made no sense. That's a quarter of the farm. Donald's response was automatic calculation. I know. You'd have to pay. That's over $600,000. Disbelief made the numbers feel abstract. 648,530, according to Stephen. I talked to him yesterday. Kenneth confirmed he understood exactly what he was proposing. The silence that fell was absolute. Donald stared at Kenneth like watching a mirage form in the desert, something that couldn't be real but appeared solid anyway. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. Why? The word came out broken. Why would you do that? Kenneth was quiet for a moment, choosing words carefully. Understanding this answer mattered as much as the offer itself. My father taught me something. He said a man's not measured by what he takes from others. He's measured by what he gives back, especially when giving costs something. He paused, making sure Donald was listening, making sure the words would penetrate. That day at the fair, that $10,000, it was never about money for me. It was about respect. You treated me like I was nothing, like my tractor was nothing, like 50 years of my family's work didn't matter, because I didn't have new equipment or more acres. Kenneth's voice stayed level, factual, not accusatory, but clear. I wanted you to see that you were wrong. That's all I wanted, to prove the point. But I didn't want to destroy you. I didn't want your children to lose their home. Kenneth leaned forward slightly. Donald, I won that fight 4 years ago. Continuing it now doesn't make me right. It makes me you. Donald's eyes were wet. He wiped them roughly with the back of his hand, the gesture angry and ashamed simultaneously. And if I say yes, what then? His voice was barely above whisper. Then you keep farming. You've got 1,800 acres left, plus buildings, plus equipment. That's enough to make a living if you're careful. Kenneth paused. If you stop trying to be the biggest and start trying to be the smartest, he stood, replacing his cap. You've got until tomorrow morning to decide. After that, I'm buying at the auction, and I won't be offering to leave you anything. Kenneth walked out, leaving Donald sitting in his office, staring at the space where Kenneth had been trying to process the offer that made no logical sense, but represented the only path forward that didn't end in complete destruction. Margaret found her husband 20 minutes later, still sitting motionless. She'd heard nothing of the conversation, Kenneth having closed the door, but she saw something different in Donald's face. What did he want? Her question was careful, prepared for anything. He offered to pay the bank, save the farm. Donald's voice sounded distant, disconnected from the words he was speaking. All of it, Margaret felt something crack in her chest, hope and disbelief fighting for space. 600 acres for 648,000. We'd keep 1,800. Keep the buildings. Start over with no debt. Donald finally looked at his wife. The man I humiliated is offering to save us. They talked through the night, really talked for the first time in years, Margaret pointing out that 1,800 debt-free acres was more than most families farmed with. Brandon could help run the operation. They'd survive. They'd rebuild. The Thompson name would stay on this land even if the Thompson pride had to die. By dawn, Donald had made his decision. He called Kenneth at 6:30, voice rough from sleepless night, but steady. "I accept your offer." The words cost him everything and nothing, pride falling away like dead skin, revealing something underneath that might eventually become wisdom. March 13th, they met at First National Bank with Stephen Taylor officiating. Kenneth brought a cashier's check for $648,530, representing most of his life savings, plus a loan he'd taken for the first time at age 59. Stephen had approved that loan in 48 hours. Kenneth Anderson's first borrowing against land his father had paid off 24 years earlier. Donald signed the deed transferring 600 acres to Kenneth, the original Thompson homestead his grandfather had bought during the Depression. His signature was steady this time, no shaking acceptance bringing its own strange calm. The foreclosure was canceled. The auction signs came down. The Thompson family remained on their land, diminished but surviving. The story spread through Buchanan County faster than the original tractor pull tail. Kenneth Anderson saved Donald Thompson, paid off his debt, left him 1,800 acres to farm. The narrative shifted, people reassessing Kenneth not just as the man who won the bet, but as someone who understood that victory without mercy was just another form of poverty. Donald changed slowly through the following years, sold the expensive trucks, the unnecessary equipment, the trappings of being the biggest, started attending Gary Young's weekend maintenance sessions at Kenneth's barn, learning to rebuild engines instead of replacing them, fix hydraulics instead of buying new cylinders, weld broken parts instead of ordering replacements. The three men, Kenneth and Gary and Donald, formed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more substantial than acquaintance built on shared work and unspoken understanding that everyone carries damage they're trying to repair. Donald never sat on another board, never joined another committee, farmed his 1,800 acres, carefully paid attention to details he'd ignored during expansion years, learned that success, measured in sustainability, differed completely from success measured in scale. His operation wasn't the biggest anymore, but it worked. It survived. It provided. 9 years passed. June 14th, 1994. Donald was 68 years old, working alone in his north field, the one farthest from buildings, checking fence line for winter damage. The heart attack hit like a vehicle collision, sudden and complete pain radiating down his left arm and across his chest, vision narrowing, legs giving out. He collapsed beside his tractor, the engine still running, conscious but unable to move, understanding with terrible clarity that this was how his father had died, alone in a field, the land they'd worked, becoming the place they finished. Kenneth was driving to town, taking the county road that passed Thompson property, when he noticed the tractor stopped mid-field. Unusual. Donald had learned efficiency from Kenneth, learned to finish tasks completely before moving to the next. A stopped tractor in the middle of field work meant something wrong. Kenneth turned into the field access, drove across cultivated ground to where Donald's International sat idle. found Donald on the ground, conscious in obvious distress, hand pressed against chest. Kenneth knelt beside him, pulled the cell phone from his truck, dialed 911. "Stay with me, Donald. Stay with me." His voice was calm, anchoring, giving Donald something to focus on besides pain and fear. The ambulance took 22 minutes to arrive, pulling across the field, paramedics working efficiently, loading Donald onto stretcher, starting IV, monitoring vitals. Kenneth followed to the hospital in Waterloo, called Margaret. From the emergency room waiting area, sat until she and Brandon arrived 40 minutes later. The doctor's report was measured. Heart attack. Moderate damage survived due to quick response. But, and this word carried weight, Mr. Thompson cannot farm anymore. Physical strain is too much for his heart. If he continues field work, the next cardiac event will likely be fatal. Donald lay in the hospital bed, tubes connected, monitors beeping, understanding that his farming life had just ended at 68, forced retirement he wasn't ready for but couldn't fight. Kenneth visited the next day, standing beside the bed where Donald looked smaller, somehow diminished by medical equipment and forced vulnerability. 30 years, farming. Now what Donald's question was, genuine lost. "You did good. You survived. That matters more than you know." Kenneth's response was simple, true, "Because of you." Donald's acknowledgement was direct, the first time he'd said it explicitly in the 9 years since Kenneth had saved him from foreclosure. "You saved me, twice, once from the bank, once from myself." Kenneth nodded, accepting the recognition without need for elaboration. 1 month later, July 1994, Donald approached Kenneth with a final request. He wanted to sell the remaining 1,800 acres, couldn't work them anymore, didn't want Brandon trapped farming out of obligation, trusted Kenneth to farm the land properly, keep it together, rather than let it be subdivided and sold piecemeal to investors who'd never walked the ground. Kenneth took 3 days considering talking with his own son, who was 35 now, and helping run the expanded Anderson operation. The purchase would cost $3.2 million at market rates, substantial investment, even with favorable terms. But Kenneth had prospered through the recovery years of the late 80s and early 90s, saved carefully, invested conservatively. Stephen Taylor approved the financing without hesitation, Kenneth Anderson's creditworthiness beyond question. The deal closed August 15, 1994. Kenneth now owned or controlled nearly 2,400 acres, the original Anderson land, plus the Thompson homestead, plus the Patterson purchase, plus Donald's remaining holdings. The largest farming operation in Buchanan County, assembled not through aggressive expansion, but through careful stewardship and the willingness to help a defeated man when helping served no immediate self-interest. 2 weeks later, September 1st, Kenneth asked Brandon Thompson to meet him at the county recorder's office. Brandon arrived confused, his father having mentioned nothing about additional paperwork. Kenneth handed him a deed, 400 acres, deeded to Brandon Thompson. No lien, no mortgage, no payment required. Free and clear. Brandon stared at the document, not comprehending. "I don't understand why your grandfather built something on this land. Your father almost lost it. But that doesn't mean your family has to leave." Kenneth's voice carried finality that discouraged argument. "This land knows your name. It knows the Thompson name. That matters. I can't accept this. It's worth over $700,000. Brandon's protest was reflex disbelief, making acceptance impossible. You can. You will. You'll farm it well. Kenneth's certainty allowed no negotiation. Brandon had started crying then, 44 years old, but overwhelmed by generosity that made no economic sense, that violated every business principle his agricultural economics professors had taught, that represented something he'd stopped believing existed in modern agriculture. The understanding that some things matter more than maximum financial return. He'd shaken Kenneth's hand, the grip lasting long seconds, then pulled the older man into brief hug. "I'll farm it right. I promise. I swear I will." Donald Thompson died 2 years later in 1996, age 70, heart giving out finally despite medications and careful living. The funeral drew 200 people, filling the Methodist church beyond capacity, standing room in the back, and overflow into the fellowship hall. Kenneth attended, sitting quietly in the middle section, saying nothing during the service, shaking Margaret's hand afterward with simple condolence that required no elaboration. Margaret survived until 2009, age 80, long enough to see Brandon successfully farming his 400 acres, long enough to see grandchildren taking interest in agriculture, long enough to know the Thompson name would continue on land that had almost been lost. Kenneth farmed until 75, retiring in 2010 when his own health suggested slowing down was wisdom rather than weakness. His son took over the operation, 2,300 acres farmed conservatively, debts minimal, practices sustainable. The Farmall 560 sat in the barn, preserved but not restored. Maintaining its working appearance, the dents and rust and baling wire kept as reminders of August 18, 1979. Kenneth's grandson, Brandon Thompson's youngest son, took interest in the old tractor around 2010, age 16, asking permission to restore it properly. Kenneth had agreed, watching the young man strip the Farmall to bare metal, rebuild every system, repaint the faded red, reconstruct the machine while preserving its essential character. The engine kept its test mule components, still capable of the performance that had shocked Buchanan County 3 decades earlier. Kenneth Anderson died February 3, 2012, age 77, heart stopping peacefully in sleep, the quiet ending of a quiet man whose actions had spoken louder than any words. The funeral matched Donald's attendance, same church, same overflow, same recognition that someone significant had passed. Stephen Taylor attended, retired now, but still sharp, still remembering the bank meetings and loan decisions that had shaped two families' trajectories. Gary Young attended, 81 years old, walking with cane, grinning through tears as he remembered 40 years of friendship and the secret they'd kept about a test mule tractor. Brandon Thompson attended, standing beside his children, all of them farming the 400 acres Kenneth had given 15 years earlier, land they'd never sell, legacy they'd never forget. The Farmall 560 was brought to the county fair every August after Kenneth's death, displayed near the tractor pull track where it had achieved immortality. A plaque explained its history, the modifications that made it special, the competition that defined a generation. People stopped, read, smiled, some of them remembering that afternoon, some hearing the story for the first time, all of them understanding the lesson embedded in rust and metal and memory. The plaque's final paragraph captured what mattered: Don't judge by appearances. Don't bet against people you've underestimated. The rust doesn't determine value. The dents don't measure worth. What matters is what's underneath. What matters is what you do when no one's watching. What matters is whether you choose mercy when justice would be easier. Kenneth had chosen mercy, had proven that winning the fight wasn't the same as winning the war, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is help someone who hurt you, that measuring a man required looking past equipment and acreage and bank accounts to character that showed itself in crisis. The lesson cost Donald Thompson everything he thought mattered and taught him what actually did. Cost Kenneth Anderson $650,000 and earned him respect that money couldn't buy. Cost both men pride and pain and transformation payment for wisdom that couldn't be learned any cheaper. The land remains, the families remain. The story remains told at diners and feed stores and county fairs passed from generation to generation. Reminder that the old ways and old values sometimes prove more durable than new equipment and expansion at any cost, that the quietest person in the room might carry the deepest strength, that what looks like junk might hold treasure if you know how to look.